Anneliese, heiress of the Nordenfelds, glided along the street exuding refined poise and striking beauty. Without warning, two unfamiliar men closed in and offered an overly familiar greeting. Spotting her alone, they launched into coarse flirtation and pressed to know if she had any free time. She declined politely, explaining she was waiting for family, but they brazenly insisted she come with them. Anne's tone sharpened as she warned them that leaving immediately would be in their best interest. When one man reached to grab her, a cold spike of fear tightened in her chest. In that instant, a pure white spirit beast coalesced nearby, halting the harasser as if frozen by dread. Lissell, the Duke's fourth son, stepped forward with slow composure and called his sister's name. He fixed them with a hard, suspicious stare and demanded to know whether they were acquainted with her. As the family arrived, and urged the men to leave, one of them sneered and mocked Lissell as a weak kid. Lissell ordered them, voice low and firm, to step away from the young lady at once. His expression darkened as he repeated, with menace, where they intended to take Anneliese. An unsettling chill crawled over the youth. He sensed with rising dread that something was terribly wrong. A colossal spectral wolf formed behind Lissell, its commanding presence pinning the men in terror. The ringleader recoiled in sheer horror at the sudden, inexplicable display of supernatural power. Without warning, Edwin moved like a gale, landing a brutal punch that smashed into the harasser's face. Edwin, the third son, hurried over and apologized to Anne for keeping her waiting. He bristled, ready to reprimand the attackers, while Anne, panicked, begged him not to strike recklessly. Lissell quickly informed Edwin that the men had attempted to abduct Anneliese. Enraged at the thought of anyone daring to abduct his beloved sister, Edwin surged into a fury. Julius, the composed second son, arrived with calm precision and a quiet, deadly list of options for punishment. Terrified, the two harassers could only scream as the ducal family's pressure closed in around them. Edwin gave chase relentlessly, driving them to flee in desperate, ragged flight to save themselves. Anne stepped between her brothers, striving to restrain them before the situation spiraled further. She warned the two men in a stern voice to vanish at once while they still had a chance. Suddenly, a strong pair of arms wrapped around and from behind, making her start and gasp. It was Willhart, the authoritative eldest son and head of the Nordenfeld family. Willhart declared these men to be professional kidnappers, not mere brutes causing trouble. A murderous aura radiated from him, thickening the air with oppressive, tense energy. The two young men dropped to their knees, pleading for mercy beneath the crushing authority of the ducal family. Willhart's gaze bored into them, icy, contemptuous, and utterly remorseless. Then he softened and gently asked whether his sister was hurt or shaken. Julius calmly proposed whether they should hunt the men down and eliminate the threat entirely. Edwin, eager and hot-blooded, suggested breaking their legs to ensure they would never forget the lesson. Lissell gripped his sister's sleeve in silent fury, his face flushed with indignation. And stood enclosed within the overprotective ring of her four Nordenfeld brothers. She inwardly marveled at her brother's extreme, almost suffocating protectiveness. The scene rewound to 2 years earlier in a remote northern village. Anne sat stunned as her mother made a startling announcement at the breakfast table. Mrs. Meg declared, without warning, that she planned to remarry, leaving her daughter speechless. And was shaken. There had been no prior hint or discussion of such a plan. She scolded her mother for the abruptness, but Meg only smiled and insisted this was the right moment to reveal it. To Anne, her mother seemed hopelessly clumsy, lacking the most basic domestic skills. Meg couldn't cook, clean, or sew properly, she couldn't even embroider a simple cat neatly. And wondered who could possibly endure marrying a woman so hopeless at household chores. She reflected on the 5 years since she and her mother had settled into a quiet, if modest, life together. Once taken in by a merchant family, and had always felt like an outsider, uneasy and out of place among their routines. Then one afternoon Meg appeared, wrapped her in a warm embrace, and gave Anne the genuine maternal love she had missed. And vowed silently to support any choice that would bring her mother true happiness. That quiet promise shattered the instant an even more astonishing truth was revealed. They stopped before a dazzling mansion, opulent and vast, unlike anything Anne had ever imagined. And realized, with a jolt, that her mother's fiancé must be a noble of very high rank. Upon entering, the Duke of Nordenfeld stepped forward and embraced Meg with obvious, heartfelt warmth. And stood frozen, unable to reconcile this grand aristocratic scene with everything she had expected. The head housekeeper announced in formal tones that they had arrived at the esteemed Nordenfeld household. The man so fervent with Meg's affection was, impossibly, the Duke who commanded that powerful house. Horrified, Anne struggled to accept the spectacle unfolding before her eyes. She clutched her mother's hand, instinct screaming to flee, convinced some terrible mistake had occurred. Convinced the nobleman was deceiving Meg, and rejected the scene outright. She could not imagine how a humble family like theirs could be bound by marriage to a duke. Though she had glimpses of her mother's hidden past, this reality exceeded Anne's wildest assumptions. She kept insisting to Meg that they were ordinary people with no place in aristocratic circles. Meg only smiled serenely, her gentle expression untroubled by Anne's mounting panic. The Duke apologized earnestly to Anne for not revealing the truth sooner and declared his sincere love for her mother. He pleaded for Anne's blessing of their union and vowed to try to be a good father figure. His earnest manner and commanding presence left Anne momentarily dazzled and disarmed. She was about to answer when another figure entered the room unexpectedly. A cold, authoritative voice behind them said, "Father," cutting through the warmth. Willhart appeared, stern, sharp-eyed, and instantly commanding every head to bow. The Duke introduced his eldest son, Willhart, to Anne, emphasizing the boy's role in the household. He admitted he had delegated most domestic authority to Willhart, trusting his capable hand. Without warning, Willhart leveled his sword at Anne's throat, plunging the room into stunned silence. And recoiled in terror, aghast that a noble household could greet newcomers with such merciless severity. His voice, cold as ice, demanded that she answer immediately, without stumbling. Willhart pressed hard, asking what Anne and her mother's real motives had been in approaching his father. The blade at her throat silenced and, terror stole her voice and left her mute. She concluded inwardly that living under this intimidating man's roof would be impossible. And forced herself to breathe evenly, collecting her thoughts to assess the danger and mount a reply. Willhart sneered that there was nothing in the room worth stealing and made his contempt plain. He stated flatly that any scheme she imagined would collapse utterly under scrutiny. Anne's irritation flared at his baseless suspicion and the disdain dripping from his tone. She snapped back that she was merely lost, not some calculating schemer with hidden designs. And rebuked Willhart sharply for the cruelty of aiming a blade at a defenseless woman. In that instant she realized, with a jolt, that his suspicion echoed the very prejudice she had once held herself. Willhart refused to relent, repeating his question with an unbending, stern expression. And understood then that his doubt did not stop with her, it reached toward her mother's honor as well. Reluctantly, she admitted that her mother was eccentric and lacked many practical domestic skills. A childhood memory surfaced. On her birthday Meg had insisted and remain alone in her room. At the time, and had assumed her mother simply wanted a private moment for the two of them. Raised in loneliness, and treasured her mother's affection as an irreplaceable gift. Meg always appeared at the precise moments and needed her, calling her by name with genuine warmth. She never hesitated to show a fierce, unwavering love for her daughter. To Anne, Meg was the most beloved and extraordinary mother she could imagine. Meg was the only real family and had found the single constant in her life. And vowed inwardly to protect her mother, no matter the cost. She told Willhart flatly that her mother would never con anyone for money. Willhart demanded immediate proof to back up her bold declaration. and argued that her mother's sincerity spoke for itself. He countered coldly that appearances could be deceiving. He warned that many people targeted the Nordenfeld name out of greed for status and advantage. Willhart insisted his suspicion of a stranger arriving out of nowhere was only natural and reasonable. Anneliese shot back that, if anyone's judgment mattered, it was the Duke who had chosen her mother. She held his gaze, suggesting his behavior called his father's judgment into question, and bluntly asked whether he truly meant to imply the Duke could be fooled by a romantic ruse. Willhart went rigid, speechless before the woman's bold logic and the audacity of her retort while the blade hovered. Almost immediately she realized she'd overstepped, blurting words she should never have spoken. Panic rose, she chastised herself for insulting the father of the man now holding a sword to her throat. She berated herself for losing her temper and letting his provocation dictate her tongue. Quickly she bowed her head and begged Willhart's pardon for her insolence, and apologized again and again, conceding she had crossed a line. Speaking of the Duke. Flustered, she insisted her mother truly loved the Duke and claimed they were simply lost. Pressed by steel at her throat, she sputtered that she couldn't explain properly and begged him to lower the weapon. Willhart sighed, unimpressed by the melodrama, while and reeled from having spoken out of turn. When she caught a slight softening in his expression, she timidly asked if he now believed her innocence. He replied frostily that he had no reason to trust her, leaving and momentarily stunned. Still, he conceded that ejecting her without proof would contradict his father's decision. He stated bluntly that this obligation alone was why he would let her go unharmed, for now, and opened her mouth to call after him with more explanations, but he turned his back and strode away. Unable to contain her anger, she shouted after the arrogant eldest son as he walked off. Once free of the household, and escaped into the open air and drew a long, liberating breath. She reflected sardonically that the cold, disagreeable man would never stoop to give her proper directions. As she stumbled back along familiar corridors toward her room, a bucket of water crashed from a high window onto her head, and stood rooted, drenched and incredulous, wondering whether the act was prank or malice. A triumphant, mocking laugh rang from the window above. Edwin perched on the sill, grinning as he reveled in his sister's sodden, miserable state. He taunted that her disheveled condition suited someone he assumed greedy and scheming. Edwin accused her of coming for the family's fortune and reminded her that his brother had already threatened her with a sword. And froze, realizing a single, bitter prejudice underpinned all the hostility directed at her. The boy piled on insults, declaring his brother had no patience for commoners like Anne. Having had his fun, Edwin hopped down from the sill, satisfied with his petty torment. He smugly announced that he, rather than his preoccupied elder brother, would take responsibility for looking after her. Refusing to endure the humiliation, and seized the same bucket and slammed it down onto the insolent boy's head. Edwin yelped in surprise and pain as the sudden blow landed from behind. Watching him stagger with the bucket stuck on his head, and felt her anger drain into a grim, satisfying relief, Edwin exploded, demanding to know what the brat thought she was doing to him. And shot back that his accusations described exactly what she'd done and dared him to see if he'd walk away unscathed after pushing her. She snorted coldly, insisting he was the one who'd started the whole mess, and flashed a sly smile and asked if he wanted her to recount the entire episode to their father. The boy visibly crumbled, panic in his voice as he begged her not to drag their father into such petty affairs, and snapped that if he truly thought it trivial, he shouldn't have provoked her to begin with. Elsewhere in the manor, a stern lady-in-waiting demanded to know what the young master was staring at out the window. Lissell jumped and turned, frightened, murmuring an apology to his attendant. The innocent boy admitted he'd heard his father's new wife and her daughter had arrived at the manor. He longed to run outside and personally welcome his new mother and sister. A maid spat a cruel remark, mocking him as a fool for rushing to call those strangers his family. She callously invoked his dead mother, digging at the child's wound with brutal precision. As Lissell tried to explain, she barked for him to be silent and forbade any protest. The venomous woman reminded him harshly that his birth had cost his mother her life and demanded whether he felt any gratitude at all. She pressed on, furious, asking if he could be so heartless to be unconcerned for his mother and insisting no one could ever replace her. Lissell's eyes filled with sorrow, he offered only a trembling apology. The maid shifted to a falsely indulgent tone, saying it was natural for someone his age to err. Her softness twisted into a calculating, wicked smile aimed at the child. She insulted Lissell as useless and inept and forbid him from leaving the room without explicit orders. Her voice cooled into a threat. No one wanted him to become a disgrace to House Nordenfeld. Lissell stood alone in the vast chamber, a small, fragile figure swallowed by loneliness and hurt. By the third morning in the manor, and sat at breakfast with her parents while her 4 brothers were conspicuously absent. Duke Nordenfeld offered a regretful apology for his son's absence, and noticed her brothers behaved properly only under their father's gaze and otherwise acted as if she didn't exist. She inquired about Lissell and learned with concern that he still felt unwell and could not appear. The name Lissell and his unexplained absence nagged at Anne's thoughts. The Duke confessed with a heavy heart that his former wife had tragically died giving birth to the youngest son. He admitted in remorse that he'd failed to give Lissell enough attention, leaving the boy attached only to his nursemaid. Anne's eyes widened as she absorbed the sad, hidden corners of this powerful family's history. Before their departure from the manor, the Duke announced another unexpected decision. He revealed that he and Anne's mother planned to take their honeymoon at the start of next week. Anne and the others reacted with stunned surprise at such a sudden, impulsive plan. Anne's startled exclamation rang through the Duke's ornate dining hall. As promised the previous week, all preparations for their trip had been finalized. In truth, the honeymoon was a pretext for the Duke and his new wife to tour and inspect their lands. And watched them leave with a worried expression, anxious about the days she would spend alone in the manor. Her unease proved justified as she soon encountered the harsh realities of life inside the household. Politely, Anne asked a passing maid where she might fetch a glass of water in the sprawling house. The maid snapped with scorn that water was obviously found in the kitchens. With that she turned on her heel and stalked away, leaving Anne stranded in the corridor. And hesitated to call after her for directions, but the maid had already vanished without a backward glance. A cluster of maids nearby chatted and laughed, deliberately ignoring every request from the new young mistress. And felt utterly crushed by the household's chill and the servants' open contempt. After a moment to steady herself, she quietly acknowledged she could partly understand their resentment. From their perspective, serving a girl of common birth who'd abruptly risen in status felt intolerable. She remembered tales of ruthless rivalry for every post within the Duke's household. When night fell she sat alone in the vast, eerily silent chamber, swallowed by the house's emptiness. It seemed the staff had melted away, no one bothered to check whether she needed anything. As darkness crept in, and stood rooted, anxiety pressing like a stone in her chest. A bitter truth settled on her, she didn't even know how to light a simple flame. Most illumination in the opulent manor came from sophisticated arcane devices, not humble candles. In this kingdom, magic was universal, woven into daily life and household routines. People routinely channeled their minds to operate enchanted domestic appliances. And faced a crippling barrier, she couldn't tap into that supposed magical aptitude. She stared at the antique arcane lamp, a knot of dread tightening in her throat. She shook the tiny bell and pleaded for light, but nothing answered. She exhaled, the failed attempt confirming the worst fear she'd long carried. Anxiety gnawed at her. Without light, the room's shadows felt threatening and immediate. Steeling herself, she drew a deep breath and decided to try the lamp one more time. Suddenly a sharp crack echoed through the hall, startling a nearby maid into a jump. The maid rushed toward the sound, alarm and dread written across her face. and stood amid scattered shards, stunned and mortified by the broken relic. The maid snapped, furious. What did she think she was doing with the Duke's treasured belongings? And admitted, voice tight, that she'd always been clumsy and inept with magical devices. A painful memory rose. Back in her merchant household she had been ridiculed for bungling the simplest tasks. She recalled the cruel accusation that she ruined anything she touched. The maid scolded Annalise harshly for breaking Duke's property and ordered her to step away. Annalise bowed her head in a contrite apology as the maid's displeasure remained plain. She glanced at her reddened hands and rued not having brought a simple lamp from home. The next morning she was escorted from the room while servants cleared up the wreckage. She wondered whether the cleanup was charitable or further proof they despised her. Then she noticed a boy hiding nearby, whispering urgently for someone to stay hidden. Annalise froze mid-step when she found herself face to face with the child. The boy stared at her in wide-eyed astonishment, as if he'd glimpsed an intruder in his refuge. She pressed him gently. Was he the Duke's fourth son? The question flustered him. Panicked, the child apologized and bolted, ignoring her calls to wait. He vanished in an instant, leaving the young mistress bewildered and alone in the courtyard. Annalise wondered, confused, whether her face had looked too intimidating a moment before. As she turned the thought over, something shifted behind her. A small wolf padded forward and began nosing curiously at the hem of her dress. The creature's bright, affectionate face melted Anne's tension in an instant. She realized this must be the secret the boy had been desperate to hide. The pup pressed close and licked her cheek, and gasped, delighted and surprised. She laughed softly as the tiny animal's affection warmed and tickled her. A voice suddenly called from behind, making her whirl around to see who spoke. Edwin appeared, scowling, and barked an accusation about her being in that part of the grounds. He jabbed a finger at the creature in her arms, recoiling and shouting as if it were a grotesque aberration. He hissed that he'd report her to the eldest at once, promising severe consequences. Panicking, Annalise clapped a hand over his mouth and begged, voice trembling, for him to keep silent. She held him fast, refusing to let him bolt and betray the secret as he twisted to escape. He assumed the pup belonged to the youngest son and couldn't understand why she cared so fiercely. And remembered the silver-haired, blue-eyed boy and realized the pet must belong to Lissell. She understood, with a pang, that the poor child had secretly been tending this tiny creature alone. And pleaded that everyone keep small confidences from their parents sometimes, and exposure would shatter the fragile trust he'd placed in her. She clasped her hands together and begged Edwin to show mercy, protect Lissell, and keep the secret. Edwin went pale and froze, taken aback by the raw sincerity in his sister's voice. He composed himself and warned that soft words alone wouldn't be enough to change his mind. Edwin sneered, asking why she bothered with someone who hadn't even acknowledged her, accusing her of using the younger brother. And answered firmly that she meant no harm and dared him to ask Lissell himself if she was lying. Edwin snapped that she was naive. How could Lissell reply when he barely left his room? Hearing that Lissell was kept isolated stunned and Edwin's face tightened as he realized he'd revealed too much. He dashed away, muttering he'd let it slide this once, but warned it would not happen again. In a dim, cramped room, Lissell panted, exhausted, pressing himself against the sealed door. He couldn't shake the bright memory of Annalise's smile in the garden, it replayed behind his eyes. Thoughts of the new woman in his family churned through him, leaving a mix of curiosity and unease. A cold voice cut the silence, accusing him sharply of whatever mischief the nursemaid imagined. The nursemaid loomed in the doorway, menacing and imposing, forcing the child to shrink and avert his eyes. She scolded Lissell for daring to leave his room without permission, her tone razor-sharp. The maid berated him as stubborn and disobedient. Lissell could only murmur a meek apology. She cruelly repeated that his birth had cost his mother's life, pressing the wound into salt. The woman added, without remorse, that a sinful child like him should have been abandoned long ago. She kept up a volley of verbal cruelty, tormenting the terrified child with relentless spite. She warned that once the eldest inherited, Lissell would be cast out of the house without a second thought. She noted that none of his brothers visited and ordered him to obey her utterly at all times. As punishment, he was denied dinner and confined to his room so as not to inconvenience anyone. The maid's eyes glittered with malice and triumph as she watched the child slump into submission. She made Lissell memorize a litany of lies insisting that everyone in the house was kind and caring. He was forced to declare he was fine and happily content each day, ready to repeat those false words. She clamped a rough hand over his face and demanded he smile convincingly, as if all were well. Lissell forced a tear-blurred smile, aching to believe that this harsh woman was his only protector. Late that night, throat dry, Anneliese crept downstairs to fetch a drink in secret. She recalled that when their father had lived there had always been water at hand, never this neglect. Walking the dim corridor, she halted at an odd mark on the floor that pricked her curiosity. In the shadowed hallway she spotted a small shape curled motionless on the cold stone. And froze in horror as she recognized the figure, the poor youngest brother, Lissell. The child lay curled, trembling and sobbing, swallowed by the night's bitter chill. Even feverish and delirious, Lissell was tormented by the belief that he was a cruel punishment fate had inflicted. He flinched as the maid's words replayed in his mind, that no one in this family truly loved him. Pain and loneliness closed around the exhausted child's small heart, crushing the last of his strength. He thrashed in the darkness, consumed by a rising tide of hatred and the heavy burden of long-held shame. Anneliese swept him into her arms, murmuring gentle reassurances and guiding him to slow, steady breaths. At the sight of Anne's tender face, Lissell stared as if half convinced his mother had returned to him. She drew the little brother close, offering the warmth and solace that had been denied him for years. Cradled in his sister's arms, Lissell's breathing eased and he finally slipped into a calm, untroubled sleep. A rush of relief and gratitude flooded and she had reached him in time. She looked around the vast, lifeless chamber, spacious but utterly devoid of human warmth. Everything in the room was arranged with an obsessive neatness that felt disturbingly unsuited to a child. She noticed there were no toys scattered or worn, clear evidence of Lissell's enforced isolation. Even in sleep, Lissell clung to Anneliese's hand, as if terrified she might vanish. A slight movement from the boy sharpened Anne's attention. She watched every tiny stir with mounting concern. His faint whisper of mother in the dream tightened her chest with a painful, sympathetic ache. And wondered if she had misread him all along, perhaps the boy had not disliked her. She realized he was mourning the mother he had lost, not rejecting her presence. Her memory flashed to their father's telling of his late wife's death, vivid and painfully raw. Regret washed over her for not noticing or tending to this neglected youngest sibling sooner. And resolved to stay longer, determined to steady the child's trembling spirit. She sat on the bedside floor in quiet vigil, watching over Lissell through the long night. She kept her brother company until the first pale light of dawn crept across the sky. Before the servants stirred, and slipped back to her room, careful to leave no sign of her absence. A sudden idea ignited in her mind, filling her with fresh resolve and nervous excitement. The head maid opened the door and asked coldly what the young mistress could possibly want at such an hour. And smiled and explained she had seen Lissell unwell the night before and had come to check on him. She noted the maid's reaction was oddly restrained, far from the response she had expected. The maid's evasive glance and unusual manner pricked a small spark of suspicion in Anne. At that moment Lissell appeared behind the maid, interrupting their exchange. Instantly the maid's tone melted into syrupy concern as she fussed over him. And said softly that she had been worried and had hurried over to make sure he was all right. Those two syllables, worried, stilled Lissell, flooding him with unexpected emotion. The boy offered a shy apology for any trouble he might have caused the previous day. He hesitated, wanting to express deep gratitude for Anneliese's kindness but unsure how to find the words. and noticed Lissell's hands trembling and, with a pang, felt her heart ache for him. The head maid regarded the siblings with a calculating, ice-cold stare that set and on edge. She watched Anne's every gesture in silence, as if hunting for any sign of weakness to exploit. Annalise forced the brightest, most reassuring smile she could, determined to calm her frightened brother. She proposed a short walk together, an opportunity for the siblings to exchange proper hellos. The maid hesitated, feigning concern about the boy's health before vaguely protesting Anne's plan. Without waiting for permission, Anne scooped Lissell into her arms. He stared in stunned surprise. The maid cried out in alarm, but Anne was already striding away with the child, leaving the woman helpless. And waved mischievously as she departed, savoring the maid's scowl and muttered outrage. She dashed through sunlit flower beds, holding Lissell close and breathing in the liberating warmth of morning. As soon as she set him down, and apologized for the suddenness of her impulsive escape. Watching his expression, she realized something trembled within him, an unease she could not yet name. Lissell mumbled another apology for yesterday's trouble, leaving Anne both puzzled and uneasy. She soothed him gently, insisting he had done nothing wrong and need not apologize. And asked after his health with quiet concern and exhaled in relief when she saw he was truly well. Only then did a genuine sense of comfort wash over the young mistress, easing some of her tension. She admitted, smiling warmly, that she had been deeply worried about him. Lissell felt an unfamiliar warmth unfurl within him at her unexpected kindness. Remembering suddenly, Anne brightened and revealed she had brought a small surprise for his companion. She produced a neatly wrapped loaf of fragrant bread and offered it to him with an encouraging smile. Lissell smiled shyly, then confessed sadly that he had never once fed his companion by hand. And was stunned, she had assumed the two always shared meals together. She laughed, bright with curiosity, eager to see whether the little creature would enjoy the loaf. The siblings held their breath as the pup padded forward cautiously to scent the bread. The little wolf sprang onto Lissell in a burst of excitement, provoking delighted, bubbling laughter. Watching her brother play so freely, Anne felt a warm happiness bloom and returned his joyous smile. Still, she hesitated. The pup looked noticeably larger than the day before, and the change unsettled her. Pushing her doubts aside, Anne eagerly asked to join their game. The three of them ran and tumbled through the lush gardens, laughing in the bright morning sun. Their merriment ended abruptly when Edwin materialized behind them, causing Anne to start and turn. She called his name, but he snapped that she must use the proper title, Master. And sighed inwardly, already guessing what trouble the young master might be hunting for. Edwin examined the creature closely and realized it was not a mere pet but Lissell's spirit beast. When Anne blinked in disbelief, Edwin was astonished she had been playing with it all along without knowing. Once confirmed, and recoiled, what she thought a tiny dog was in fact a potent magical being. In their world, spirit beasts share magic like humans and can shift forms when their energy surges. Edwin wondered aloud, he had never heard Lissell had formally bound a spirit beast before. He explained that spirit beasts draw magical energy from the person who forms their pact. Putting the pieces together, Edwin realized this explained why Anne's magic had been unusually drained these past 2 days. Edwin was momentarily speechless at his sister's naivety, and bristled, stung by his condescension. To her surprise, Edwin faltered and offered a sincere apology that caught Anne off guard. He admitted he had suspected her of colluding with beast trainers for some hidden motive. Anne smiled and assured him she had paid those rumors no heed. She praised his concern for the family's welfare, calling it admirable despite his youth. She also apologized for letting her temper push their disagreement farther than it should have. Edwin bristled immediately, claiming his spirit was older and refusing to accept her as sister. He demanded she listen, but Anne cut in with a pressing question that needed answering now. She asked whether it was customary for nobles to address their head maid with the honorific madam. Edwin stated bluntly that servants were never afforded such lofty titles. and recalled with growing unease that little Lissell always addressed his attendant with that unusually respectful term. The maid's cruel face flashed in Nordenfeld's memory, sharpening her suspicions. And wondered why Lissell would break expected aristocratic norms by treating a servant with such deference. The image of Lissell collapsing in the cold hallway that night rose again to haunt her. She remembered the poor child begging the maid not to abandon him, pleading from a place of utter loneliness and despair. Lissell screamed, jerking up and demanding she stop her brutal abuse at once. The woman loomed over him, eyes cold and contemptuous, her face unreadable and unfeeling. The terrified boy could not fathom why he was forced to endure such relentless cruelty. The maid berated Lissell for ignoring her warnings and trailing after the newcomer, Anne. His wrenching sobs seemed only to amuse her, as though his suffering were entertainment. Though the Duke's son by birth, Lissell had been reduced to dependency, his fate tied to the maid's favor. The image of Anne cradling him stood in stark contrast to the daily, calculated isolation he endured. For years she had used cunning and cruel words to poison the child's trust in anyone else. She feigned comfort, telling him not to cry, while being the very source of his torment. With a venomous smile she taunted him, did he truly believe he was mistreated and bullied? She coerced Lissell into confessing he needed and loved her, then twisted that dependency to control him. The frightened child mumbled assent as the maid's grin widened in sick, perverse satisfaction. She dismissed his broken toy as trivial, offering a hollow promise to buy another as if that erased the harm. Feigning tenderness, she offered to carry him just like Miss Annalise, a mocking mimicry of real care. At that instant a black, menacing aura began to coil around the maid's hands, dark and hungry. Sensing imminent danger, Lissell writhed and fought desperately to wrench free from her grip. He watched her retreating form in stunned bewilderment as her expression snapped into something monstrous. The child trembled uncontrollably as the terrifying truth of his caretaker's cruelty settled like a cold weight. The small bell, his mother's precious keepsake, was wrenched from his fingers and flung aside without a second thought. Lissell sobbed hysterically as the one memento of his mother shattered on the floor before him. That bell was his sole link to his late mother, held as if it were his very lifeline. Overwhelmed by agony, the child could only wail in helpless despair within the dim, isolating room. Lissell's blood-curdling scream rang through the cold chamber like a raw plea into the void. Outside the window, a giant spirit beast watched with reddened eyes, its gaze burning with fury. The wolf crashed into the room with lethal force, driven to protect its trembling master. Panicked, Lissell begged the creature to stay back, terrified of the unfolding violence. He pleaded for mercy in a frantic, repeating chorus as the scene spiraled beyond control. Edwin froze in the corridor, his skin prickling at the sound of his brother's agonized screams. He burst into the room and recoiled in horror. The maid's arm was torn and bleeding from the spirit beast's assault. Edwin called Lissell's name frantically as he found his brother crumpled and motionless amid the ruined chamber. He rushed to his side, checking desperately whether Lissell had survived the terrifying attack. The enormous spirit beast growled, and an oppressive weight settled over the room like a dark cloud. Edwin realized with mounting awe that the creature shared an unusually deep, spiritual bond with Lissell. Seeing his brother slip toward unconsciousness, Edwin was flooded with crushing regret and unbearable grief. As he reached out, the spirit beast bared its fangs in warning, freezing him in place. Without warning, the creature lunged at Edwin, unleashing the full ferocity of an enraged magical guardian. He had only time to raise an arm and squeeze his eyes shut, bracing for a devastating strike. Edwin opened his eyes in stunned disbelief at the sudden, disquieting silence that fell over the beast. Before him stood Annalise, composed and fearless, her hand outstretched as if to halt the attack. She offered a gentle, reassuring smile and told them both that everything would be all right now. The memory rewound to a bleak, rainy day from Lissell's past, when he had been utterly alone and drenched. Through the window he had once seen a tiny figure collapse in the downpour, barely clinging to life. Lissell realized the collapsed animal was a starving wolf cub, curled up and exhausted against the mansion's outer wall. Ignoring the sting of cold and rain, he slipped outside to investigate the creature's desperate condition. Timidly, Lissell reached out, his small hand trembling as he touched the shivering little wolf. The cub stirred and blinked awake, and the boy's fear dissolved into a rush of relief at its survival. From that moment on, an unlikely friendship quietly took root between two lonely souls. Lissell began secretly tending to and playing with his newfound companion, hiding their meetings from the cruel maid. He whispered to the pup, asking if it too felt the same hollow loneliness that gnawed at him. Memory held a soft image of Lissell stroking the cub, the first fragile thread of their secret bond. He smiled, realizing the small creature mirrored his solitude and understood him in ways others never had. Those stolen hours with the four-legged friend became tender, precious sanctuaries for the child. Lissell guarded the wolf like a secret jewel, a vow forming in his heart to cherish and protect it at all costs. Anneliese faced the towering spirit beast with steady resolve, meeting its fury without flinching. The creature's sudden strike shredded her sleeve, blood darkened the white fabric as she gasped from the pain. Looking into the wolf's blazing red eyes, she tried to discern whether it was lost, enraged, or guarding something deeper. Edwin stood frozen in horror, rooted to the spot by the violent tableau before him. He cried out in panic at the sight of the deep gash along his sister's arm. He scooped up the trembling Lissell and shouted their names as he rushed forward, heart pounding. He asked anxiously about Lissell's condition, but the child stood motionless, stunned into silence. And clutched her bleeding arm and, through gritted teeth, insisted she felt responsible for what had happened. Lissell broke down into sobs, racked with guilt and convinced he had caused the disaster. Edwin stared in disbelief, unable to reconcile his sister's calm words with the chaos around them. Anneliese turned away from the accusation and firmly insisted their conclusions were wrong. Looking into Lissell's tear-filled eyes, she repeated gently but firmly that this was not his fault. And forced a warm, reassuring smile to soothe Lissell and affirm his innocence in the incident. The spirit beast continued to snarl as Anne's blood fell in dark drops onto the floor. Guards and the head maid burst into the room, frantic voices demanding to know if young Master Lissell was safe. The malicious maid pointed at the wolf and cried foul, loudly alleging the creature had suddenly attacked the boy. Lissell and his spirit beast stared at one another, both bewildered, ringed now by hostile guards. Pushing through the pain, and barreled between the guards and the wolf, ordering them to stand down. Her jaw set with fierce resolve, she would protect her brother and his companion, whatever the cost. She declared loudly that no one had the right to kill that pitiful creature. The guards and the maid recoiled, stunned and unable to comprehend her audacious defense. The head maid's smile curdled into something poisonous as she recognized a perfect opportunity to ensnare Anne. She shifted into a shrill accusation, blaming Anneliese for orchestrating the entire chaotic scene. Striding forward with feigned outrage, she charged that Anne had used deceit to abduct the young master. And stood stunned, aghast at how brazenly the woman twisted truth into damaging lies. Confusion seized her as she frantically searched for any way to escape the trap closing around them. And feared that a single misplaced word would doom Lissell to merciless punishment. Edwin stepped forward to shield Lissell, stammering that the spirit beast was harmless and meant no harm. Willhart appeared abruptly in the doorway, his expression ice-cold as he demanded an explanation. At his arrival, the guards and the maid immediately bowed their heads in fearful deference. Willhart swept his gaze across the ruined chamber and fixed on the blood-soaked sleeve clinging to his sister. He commented coldly that he had returned to find an intolerable scene of chaos. The eldest demanded to know how a dangerous spirit beast had been allowed to breach so deep into the manor. Trembling, the maid jabbed a finger at Anne, heaping every accusation on her and insisting she had brought the creature in. Willhart stepped closer, gripped Anne's injured arm, and spoke with incredulous restraint. The maid kept clamoring, alleging the wound was self-inflicted, a manipulative ploy to control the young master. Unable to bear the slander, Lissell cried out that the accusations were lies. Ignoring the protests, Willhart ordered Lissell to stand and give his own account of the incident. Terrified, Lissell shrank behind Edwin, voice quivering as words failed him. At last the child mustered courage and declared, in a small but steady voice, that the wolf was his close friend. Willhart shot back sharply, even if it was his friend, why had it inflicted such a grievous wound on your sister? Lissell looked up at his eldest with bewildered, hurt eyes, unable to find the words to respond. Willhart's tone hardened as he told Lissell that friendship required responsibility and accountability. He loomed over his kneeling brother and declared that Lissell must accept full responsibility for the chaos. The eldest insisted that harming others could not be dismissed as mere childish mischief. Lissell bowed his head, swallowing the reprimand, and whispered his brother's name through choked sobs. Willhart stood like a pillar in the wrecked room, the air tightened around them until it felt suffocating. And flinched, shaken, struggling to process the harshness of his words. Judging the injury serious, he ordered at once that she be taken for urgent medical treatment. And shouted that her wound mattered little next to the suffering the child endured. Rage flared in her as she listened to everyone heap blame on a defenseless child. Her gaze snapped to Willhart and the maid, contempt blazing as she fought to mask her disbelief at their coldness. She exploded, demanding how he could possibly fault a boy of 7. Willhart steadied her with a firm grip and warned she would faint if she kept shouting while losing blood. She lashed out, calling him arrogant and blind to the vulnerability of a child's mind. Willhart retorted icily that she could not comprehend the burdens tied to noble duty. She stared at her bloodied hands and demanded whether he had ever truly taught their brother anything at all. She declared she had no use for the glittering prestige and reputation he worshipped. With bitter anger she demanded why he placed honor above Lissell's health and peace of mind. And continued to scream in righteous fury while his posture remained unmoved and cold. Suddenly her vision blurred and the world tilted violently around her. Willhart's alarm spiked as he saw his sister's complexion go ghostly pale. Nausea and exhaustion overwhelmed and she felt her knees give way. She slumped into Willhart's arms after murmuring a few pained words. Chaos erupted as she fell. Edwin and Lissell lunged to her side in frantic alarm. Her face had gone deathly pale, she lost consciousness from blood loss and shock. Willhart swept her up without hesitation while Edwin repeated her name in desperate calls. The wolf snarled to hold the guards at bay as Lissell begged it to stop harming anyone else. Willhart produced a vial of magic and hurled it at the frenzied spirit beast. The enchanted device struck the wolf, embedding itself as a concentrated blue light flared outward. Arcane electricity crackled over the creature, it held in agony before finally collapsing. Willhart ordered the beast caged and had Lissell removed to another room for immediate isolation. A guard opened his mouth to ask how to handle the young master but fell silent under Willhart's forbidding stare. He ordered and carried to the parlor at once and summoned the estate's finest physician. Willhart bore and away, his footsteps heavy through the hushed corridors of the Nordenfeld estate. Anne's question, why he cared so little for Lissell, kept reverberating in Willhart's mind. He remembered his childhood, when their mother would chastise him for ruling with excessive severity. She had gently urged him to temper his harshness toward family. As a boy he had believed a future lord must never show weakness, even to his own blood. He convinced himself that birth into a great house meant accepting heavy, unavoidable burdens. Their mother would smile, ruffle his hair, and admit his convictions had some merit. She trusted the sincerity and steady principles her son displayed. Yet she always reminded Willhart that family required not only duty but compassion and understanding. Now, at the bedside, Willhart sat in silence, watching Anne's sleeping face. Images of Anne and Lissell blurred together, stirring a tangle of guilt and protectiveness in him. A servant knocked and announced the doctor had arrived to examine her, as instructed. Willhart rose and, looking out the window, implored the physician to do everything possible for the young lady. The maid hurried after him, calling Edwin's name and ordering the boy to stop at once. She urged Edwin to let the doctor inspect his wound too, but he brusquely waved her away. Edwin snapped that he was fine and did not require assistance. He dismissed the maid and insisted the doctor focus on Lissell and they needed care far more than he did. Edwin lingered alone in the corridor, head bowed, remorse etched across his face. Anne's rebuke about not blaming children replayed in his mind, cutting deeper than he'd expected. He clenched his fists until they trembled with helplessness and regret. In a burst of frustration he struck the wall and cursed himself for his helplessness. He berated himself for standing idle while Willhart quelled the chaos, and he marveled that even little Lissell had not flinched. He pictured Annalise's radiant smile, soft as morning light, dispersing the day's tension. Edwin clicked his tongue in annoyance, displeasure still lingering after the ordeal. He trudged down the corridor and halted before a large, closed door. A gloved hand reached out and eased the heavy wooden door open with practiced caution. Edwin peered inside, wondering whether the doctor tended to their father's illegitimate daughter as he'd been told. A maid hushed him with a finger to her lips and reminded the others to address the woman as Miss Protocol, she warned. With a worried look, the maid murmured she'd heard Miss Annalise's wound was dangerously deep. Edwin froze as servants whispered that the scar might ruin any chance of splendid gowns in her future. The maid's grin turned venomous as she declared the incident worked to their advantage. She added smugly that now they had the perfect pretext to sequester the commoner's daughter forever. Hidden behind the door, Edwin's fist shook with mounting fury at the servant's malicious scheming. In another room, a lady's maid draped a blanket over Lissell and urged the young master to rest obediently. Lissell perched on the bed, dazed and anxious, as if a question hovered on his lips. He timidly asked about his sister's condition, catching the maid off guard with his sudden concern. The maid responded casually that the doctor had treated Miss Annalise and she would be fine. She told Lissell not to fret and to focus on resting, then left the room. Alone, Lissell pulled the blanket over his head and gave way to quiet, relentless sobs. Annalise's gentle, protective smile, despite her injury, remained vivid in the boy's mind. Unable to remain still, the child flung off the blanket and climbed down from the bed in the dead of night. Barefoot and silent, Lissell padded across the cold floor toward his sister's door. He had just eased the door open when Edwin stepped from the shadows behind him, sending a jolt of fright through the boy. Edwin's voice softened. "Don't be afraid, it's only me," he murmured, advancing slowly to avoid startling him further. He lingered awkwardly in the doorway, his cheeks were flushed but his eyes held a steady, worried light. He guessed Lissell had slipped over to check on their sister. The boy bowed his head and offered a thin, apologetic whisper. Edwin hushed him sharply, ordering him to stop apologizing for small things and reassuring him that coming here was the right thing to do. Then Edwin opened his hand and pressed something into Lissell's palm, instructing him to give it to their sister from him. Nestled in his palm lay a delicate pearl pendant, its surface catching the dim light and throwing back a soft, muted sparkle. He made Lissell swear to secrecy. If Willhart found out he'd explode, so the younger boy must tell no one. Having done what he needed to, Edwin turned and hurried back into the corridor, leaving Lissell stunned and clutching the gift. Lissell pressed the pendant to his chest, comforted by an unexpected tenderness from his hot-tempered brother. He tiptoed to the bedside where Annalise slept. The night wrapped them in hushed stillness. Gingerly, he laid the pendant atop her bandaged hand like a quiet, hopeful prayer. Blood had seeped through the white gauze on Anne's arm. The sight stabbed Lissell's small heart with sharp, aching pity. Unable to hold back, he bowed his head to the mattress and wept, whispering frantic apologies into the dark. Memories of the maid's harsh scoldings and punishments for every clumsy mistake surged back to torment him. The cruel servant had always taunted him as useless, the child blamed for their mother's death at childbirth. Convinced he brought only ruin, Lissell had long accepted the idea that anything precious around him would be destroyed as punishment. But amid that suffocating shame, a fragile ember of hope suddenly flared inside him. Annalise's furious cry, that no one had the right to blame a child, rang through his mind like a benediction. Her resolute voice struck him to the core, loosening some of the wounds he'd borne alone. Anne's bright face returned in his memory, assuring him with quiet certainty that none of this was his fault. Lissell begged her, voice trembling, to wake quickly. He needed her presence now more than ever. He gripped the hem of her gown and prayed desperately for the wound on her arm to heal. He longed to hear her voice again, to be told, plainly, that he truly wasn't to blame. In his dreams Anne appeared amid blooming golden mimosa, smiling and softly calling his name. Lissell choked on his sobs, wondering once more whether he could trust her words of innocence. Exhausted, he finally fell asleep beside her, still clutching the pendant as if it were a lifeline. Suddenly the pearl pendant glowed with a warm, otherworldly white light that bathed them both. Annalise stirred and released a faint, pained moan as consciousness crept back into her. She woke bewildered, blinking as if unsure how she had come to lie there. And sprang up like a coiled spring, alarmed by the strange, luminous change in the room. She hurriedly looked down at her injured arm and began peeling away the blood-soaked bandages. And froze, eyes wide, unable to believe that every severe wound had vanished without a trace. In her astonishment she noticed a small shape curled peacefully asleep at her side. She wondered how her youngest brother Lissell had come to be there, sleeping so soundly in her room. Gently checking him over, she discovered his injuries had been miraculously healed as well. And decided not to wake him. He needed rest, and the extra sleep would do him good. Lissell stirred and slowly opened his deep blue eyes, taking in the softened room. Annalise smiled gently and greeted him good morning, her voice warm in the quiet. Startled to find his sister awake, Lissell bolted upright and babbled apologies for falling asleep in her room without permission. And realized he had stayed up worrying about her all night, which explained the exhaustion etched on his face. Instead of scolding him, she thanked him with genuine warmth for caring so tenderly. Her voice quickened with concern as she asked if he had caught a chill sleeping without a blanket in the night air. Her reassurance, that none of it was his fault, settled over them like a comforting morning breeze. The boy clutched the sheet, struggling visibly as if an urgent thought fought to escape his throat. Hesitantly, Lissell asked if he might pose a question he had carried for a long time. Annalise inclined her head encouragingly, making space for her troubled little brother to speak. His voice trembling, he asked again whether everything that had happened truly wasn't his fault. He clung to her previous words like a fragile buoy in a storm, his last, desperate hope. He poured out the years of pain, the belief that his birth had killed their mother and made him inherently wicked. The poor child carried the burden of thinking his mere existence caused their mother's death and his sister's suffering. The Duke's mournful retelling of his wife's death in childbirth haunted Lissell, reopening old wounds. Annalise dismissed those dark accusations adamantly, insisting without hesitation that Lissell was wholly innocent. She told him firmly that her injury had nothing to do with him and pleaded with him to stop torturing himself. And declared, with unshakable conviction, that their mother's passing had never been his fault. She vowed to repeat that truth 1,000 times over, 10,000, until he finally believed it. Then she gave him the brightest, most radiant smile she possessed, as if to fortify his fragile spirit. Lissell looked up, stunned, as if a tremendous weight had lifted from his chest. And nodded again, every word soaked in sincerity and tenderness for her little brother. He broke down, sobbing like a child finally understood, the burden of years spilling out. His cries startled Annalise at first, then she recognized them as a necessary, healing release. She gathered him into her arms and held him tight, letting him unload the long-suppressed anguish. Lissell could not stop sobbing, his wails filled the room in a long, purging cadence. With each tear that fell it felt as if the heavy sorrows in his chest were being wrung out. When he finally calmed, the boy whispered that he wanted to spend more time talking with his sister. He voiced the wish shyly, cheeks flushed, his bashful charm made the plea all the more touching. But he feared the family would be furious if they noticed the siblings growing unusually close, and eagerly suggested they go immediately to their father and brothers to put everything plainly on the table. She believed it was crucial for Lissell's development that he learn to speak his mind and voice his wishes. She smiled reassuringly, confident that, once heard, everyone would heed what he had to say. Lissell returned her smile, radiant and trusting, full of faith in his beloved sister. Seeing her youngest agree so freely for the first time, and felt a deep, unexpected contentment in this house. Suddenly Edwin burst into the room, exclaiming with delight at finding them together. His cheer curdled into reprimand as he scolded Lissell for entering a woman's chamber without permission. Edwin snapped at Annalise, chiding her for making a fuss when he realized her arm's injuries had vanished. The younger boy stood stunned, pointing at his sister's arm with disbelief etched across his face, and cried out at the miraculous healing, only for Edwin to tease her about imagining some noble, mystical power. Startled, she dropped an object. Lissell slipped out from his hiding place to watch them both. To cover his embarrassment, Edwin spun a clumsy tale about a spider on the sheet, leaving Anne puzzled. Abruptly, Edwin remembered something urgent he had to announce. He blurted that Lissell's spirit beast, a bonded wolf, was slated for destruction, and the room fell into stunned silence. The scene snapped back an hour earlier to the manor study. A flustered attendant burst in to tell Willhart that Miss Anne had forced the little master outdoors. Cunningly, the attendant accused Anne of neglecting the frail child's health while Willhart listened, silent and unreadable. The woman insisted the whole episode was a deliberate act of rebellion against the ducal family. Willhart cut her off with icy authority, ordering her to be silent. He had no patience for such clamor. He emphasized that he had summoned her for facts, not for bitter speculation or gossip. Pale with fear, the maid dropped her gaze and stammered a hurried apology for her careless words. Willhart fell silent, poring over the papers while the servant remained on her knees in obsequious submission. The woman kneeling before him was the child's personal attendant, the one who had shadowed young Lissell for years. Willhart remembered that she had watched over his brother since Lissell was scarcely a year old. Their father had vouched for her, insisting she was trustworthy and that Lissell clung to her care. Even Lissell had told their eldest that everything was fine, that there was nothing wrong. The poor child had praised the attendant's kindness, though a shadow of sorrow still crossed his face. Still, Willhart felt an unsettling undercurrent in the household that nagged at him. He noted how the maid's testimony was tinted by personal feelings toward and rather than objective fact. Determined to form an impartial view, Willhart decided he must also hear Anne's account. The attendant persisted in falsehoods, claiming that upon returning to her room Lissell had smashed all her toys. She pronounced the accusation before the young master with inflated solemnity, as if staging a performance. She invented a story that Lissell regularly vented his frustrations on objects, though in truth she was often the one causing the damage. Feigning contrition, the maid claimed she had failed to calm the young master's anxieties. Willhart mused aloud that items in Lissell's room did seem to break with unsettling frequency. He remembered an earlier occasion when Lissell had bowed his head and confessed to smashing his own belongings. The maid recoiled slightly, invoking Willhart's name as she steered the discussion back to her chosen narrative. A sly smile flickered across her face as she hinted, loudly, about what Miss Anne might do to harm Lissell. Willhart said nothing, his expression severe and contemplative in the face of her slander. Annalise, Edwin, and Lissell crept along the corridor's shadows, and whispered anxiously, "Is he really here?" Edwin murmured that if Lissell was too frightened, he could stay behind and wait in safety. Lissell lowered his head, his whole body trembling with pure, unfiltered fear. The boy mumbled that the creature was his friend, voice barely audible. The three pressed onward, and couldn't help griping about how utterly dark the corridor was. At last they found the wolf locked inside a cage, pacing in restless confinement. And exhaled in relief, then froze when she saw the cage sealed with a heavy iron padlock. Edwin grinned with triumph and produced a cluster of keys he'd filched, leaving Anne momentarily speechless. She worried aloud about the wisdom of this plan, but Edwin dismissed her concern as needless fuss. And warned that if they were caught, Edwin would face severe reprimand. Edwin shrugged, indifferent. He said it hardly mattered, since no one seemed to trust him anyway. For a heartbeat his face clouded with a quiet melancholy as he stared into the dim distance. And gently reminded him that he wouldn't want their eldest brother to hate him for his recklessness. Her words snapped Edwin back, as if he'd suddenly remembered the stakes. With a grin, Edwin offered to take the blame himself so Anne wouldn't be implicated, prompting her to laugh. He teased Anne as foolish. How could she possibly know where the keys were hidden? Brimming with self-satisfaction, he boasted of his cleverness, claiming no one would scold him even if he slipped up, and responded with exasperation. Lissell whispered Edwin's name, eyes bright with admiration. Edwin told Lissell to stop apologizing. After tonight, he said, they were friends. Half in jest he declared himself, jokingly, Lissell's legal brother from that night onward. A dry click echoed as Edwin turned the key and the lock gave with a dull spring. Suddenly someone shouted, "Young master!" And every head snapped toward the sound. The malicious attendant burst in, shrieking triumphantly as she caught Miss and red-handed. Willhart entered behind her, his expression ice-cold while the maid's clamor grew louder. She accused Anne of scheming to exploit Lissell, claiming the beast would be brought back to menace the family. The maid explained in urgent tones that spirit beasts depended on arcane energy to live. She insisted only Lissell's unusually potent mana could sustain the creature, making it a grave danger. Willhart leveled a stern stare at Edwin that made the boy flinch. Coldly, he demanded to know what scheme Edwin believed he was engineering. He rebuked Edwin as an undisciplined brother, accusing him of skulking about and enabling covert mischief. Seeing his siblings berated, Anne stepped forward without hesitation to shield the two children. She confronted Willhart's threatening tone, warning that such intimidation would silence any honest reply. Willhart insisted he was questioning Edwin, but Anne cut in firmly, declaring she would answer for the boy. She admitted plainly that the three of them had tried to rescue the spirit beast. And repeated Lissell's words from the day before, the wolf was his closest friend. She argued it would be morally wrong to slaughter an innocent creature. Willhart listened without interrupting, his face clouded in thought. He muttered that Anne simply didn't grasp how harsh the world could be. Willhart countered by asking whether she'd ever seen a spirit beast fed human food and expected it to remain harmless. He warned that once a wolf attacked and consumed human provisions, its behavior could never be reliably controlled. Willhart declared such dangerous creatures must be dispatched, not released to roam free. He stressed the decision was final and not open to debate. At the pronouncement, Lissell could do nothing but emit helpless, broken sounds. The boy cried, "Will," his voice trembling on the verge of tears. Lissell sobbed that he absolutely refused to allow it. He collapsed to his knees, begging his eldest brother not to kill the wolf and pledging to bear any consequence. He vowed to accept full responsibility himself. Lissell's resolve to shoulder the burden stunned Willhart into silence. Willhart looked down at the kneeling child and declared that the responsibility for this matter would rest with him. Anne stood close by, worry etched into her features as she watched her little brother. She admitted she had acted rashly and offered a sincere apology for her thoughtlessness. And begged Willhart to consider whether any alternative existed to save the animal. A memory of their late mother surfaced in Willhart's mind, reminding him he could be excessively harsh. He also recalled Anne's rebuke that an elder brother should teach responsibility rather than safeguard appearances. Wilhart's gaze softened noticeably as he looked at the sobbing youngest sibling. He spoke Lissell's name quietly, signaling the start of a grave, earnest conversation. Wilhart asked plainly whether Lissell truly wished to save the spirit beast at any cost. Both Lissell and the maid answered at once. The maid's voice quivered with dread. Wilhart set a condition: Lissell must forge a formal pact with the spirit beast. Seeing the child's confusion, he explained that only someone with sufficiently strong mana could form such a bond. He said that once contracted, the creature would draw sustenance exclusively from its master's mana and be fully controlled, removing the external threat. But he paired the offer with a grave warning. Wilhart emphasized that a bonded spirit beast would be bound to, and continuously drain, its master's mana for life. He warned that if the master died, the beast would perish; if the beast died, the master would suffer excruciating feedback. He asked, cold and direct, whether Lissell was prepared to make that irreversible choice. The maid protested frantically, denouncing the proposal as absurd and unconscionable. She screamed that Lissell was only 5 and that such an arrangement would rob her of the private, cherished moments she enjoyed with the child. Wilhart snapped that a servant had no right to meddle in family affairs. The maid dug in her heels, insisting she had tended Lissell since he was an infant. She shouted that she had stood at his side longer than either the Duke or Wilhart himself. Her face contorted into a menacing leer as she proclaimed a twisted devotion to the child. And fixed the maid with cold contempt and demanded whether any of it was true. She stepped forward, gaze sharp as a blade. The maid visibly recoiled and pressed her, questioning whether the maid's professed devotion was genuine or merely self-serving. The maid exploded in fury, snapping that and had no right to lecture her. She took Ant's challenge as a grave insult to the decades she claimed to have spent in service. With a loud litany, she catalogued the sacrifices she said she'd made raising the young master. And replied coolly, asking whether the maid hadn't fled in terror when the beast first appeared. She revealed how the maid had abandoned Lissell to save herself during that crisis. And insisted this was only one in a long list of the woman's transgressions. She pointed out the oddity that Lissell addressed the maid as madam, a form of deference a noble child would never use for a servant. And noted how Lissell visibly cowered and remained tense whenever the maid was near. Enraged at being exposed, the maid flung the lamp to the floor and lunged forward as if to strike. She leapt at Lissell, clutching him and screaming his name in a frantic, possessive howl. Desperately she demanded whether it was true that Lissell loved her above all others. And fell silent, eyes locked on her brother, waiting for his reply. She knew inside that the most important thing was for Lissell to speak his truth. She gave Lissell an encouraging look, trusting he'd find courage this time. Under the maid's intimidation, Lissell stammered, lips trembling, unable to reply. At last the boy cried out that he was truly terrified of the woman. The maid froze, incredulous at the child's confession. Lissell grabbed Wilhart's sleeve and, sobbing, accused the maid of repeatedly beating him. He cried that she had poisoned his mind, forcing him to believe his mother's death was his fault. The revelation left both Wilhart and Edwin stunned by its cruelty. Lissell sobbed that he had never smashed his toys, contradicting the maid's habitual lies. The child screamed that he had endured her cruelty for years and loathed her for it. Lissell looked the maid squarely in the eye and said firmly that he did not like her at all. He shouted that he hated her with all his heart, words that shattered the maid, who sank to her knees. The wicked maid ground her teeth in fury, unable to swallow the child's blunt rejection. She ranted wildly, demanding whether Lissell understood who had supposedly cared for him since infancy. As she raged, Wilhart cut in sharply, voice cold and decisive. The maid flinched when Wilhart's blade pressed cold against her throat in a tense instant. He repeated that family matters were none of a servant's business. He glowered and asked whether he needed to repeat the warning until she truly understood. Even as the guards arrived, the maid clung to Wilhart's name, pleading for mercy one last time. Ignoring her pleas, the eldest brother coldly ordered the soldiers to restrain the hysterical woman immediately. She thrashed in despair, unable to accept being treated like a criminal within her employer's own mansion. The guards moved swiftly at Wilhart's command, encircling her and preparing to drag the venomous maid from the room. She screamed to be released, insisting she was Lissell's closest attendant and must not be removed. And Edwin and Lissell watched the chaos in stunned fear, shaken by their eldest brother's uncompromising authority. The small spirit beast mirrored the room's tension, curling tightly at Lissell's feet as if to shield him from the fear in the air. Once the chaos was contained, Wilhart stepped forward and signaled he intended to finish the interrupted conversation with his youngest sibling. He crouched to meet Lissell's eye level and, in a soft voice, asked what the boy wanted most right then. Lissell lifted his face to Wilhart with unusually bright, hopeful eyes, a brief, fragile calm after the storm. That same day an official decree dismissed Lissell's maid for severe misconduct.